Chapter 26. Red Seal Base. "I'm not going," Clea said. She turned her back on Tricker and began typing again. "Not now you're not," he agreed. "There's a hell of a blizzard going on out there." Tricker was deeply annoyed. He'd been looking forward to some time alone. Clea didn't respond, but her mind was racing. She had expected to be alone here, having taken considerable pains to convince people that she was on another transport and would meet them at their destination. The hardest to convince had been Weimeister. For a few moments, she'd been sure that he would leave his duffel behind and try to take her in its stead. Fortunately, there was a lack of seating, and safety regulations to consider, and a strong desire on no one's part to accommodate the obnoxious Kurt. And so she'd managed to stay behind, and one step ahead of Tricker's search parties. She hadn't anticipated anyone being left behind. Least of all, him. Well, she didn't necessarily object to having an ally, and someone of Tricker's skills would, no doubt, be of great help. "And then I can kill him," she thought cheerfully. "And blame it on Connor." Now she had something else to look forward to. A little bonus, as it were. The base's surveillance and recording equipment was still on, though Tricker had turned them to sample, which meant that the cameras would turn on and off at set times. So it would be easy to arrange to have the base's recording equipment happen to be off at the crucial moment. Or she could do some creative editing. She'd streamed the security system's input into Skynet so that she could access it at will, allowing her to check the whereabouts of Tricker and any would-be saboteurs. It made her feel like something was under control. Tricker watched Clea Bennett work and wished sincerely that she wasn't here. He wouldn't want her here anyway because he didn't like her. But in his gut, he thought the facility was about to be visited by some very determined thieves. Or terrorists, he thought. Though no terrorist would really enjoy destroying a deserted facility. Anyway, he didn't want to put an asset at risk. Not that I have a choice. He'd powered down the rest of the facility. Everything had a chilly, abandoned smell already, like a deserted house in winter. But he supposed he could give Bennett enough juice to keep her happy. He'd drag in a cot and a sleeping bag for her, and this could be her world for however long it took her to get out of here. If she was like most of the other scientists, that would be her idea of heaven. When he dragged the cot in, he made sure to create enough noise to be annoying. It pleased him when she looked over her shoulder to glare at him. He enjoyed annoying certain types of people. Probably why I almost never get promoted, he thought ruefully. There had to be some reason. He knew without false modesty that he was very good at the things he did. "You might as well sleep in here," he said. The rest of this place is going to be pretty cold in a little while. She nodded. I suppose it's best to conserve energy. Always. He agreed. Where are you going to sleep? She asked. He jerked his thumb at the ceiling, and she nodded again, then went back to work. He snorted in disgust. It always annoyed him when people dismissed him. On the other hand, with scientists, it was often more a case of your not really being there in the first place, as far as they were concerned. In any case, up in the huts that disguised the real base, he'd be a lot more comfortable than she'd be. They were well insulated and had more traditional heating and sanitary facilities, which meant they were somewhat primitive, but they worked no matter what. He'd been a bit surprised that the commander hadn't simply left the usual crew in place there. But then she hadn't bothered to explain her reasoning to Tricker. She'd only nodded when he requested permission to stay behind, not even bothering to ask for his well-reasoned arguments. Just as well, he thought. They'd probably have sounded paranoid to her. Clea listened to the racket the human was making. At least she knew he'd function well as an early warning system when Connor and his crew showed up. Clea changed the screen before her and added a line of text, then ran a routine to test it. And if Connor or one of his allies actually took Tricker out, that would simplify things nicely. She suppressed the pang she'd felt at the thought of someone else killing Tricker. She couldn't afford sentimentality. The test failed, and she forced herself to change it slightly and run it again. She must remain calm and ready. Skynet's sentience had been an accident. That much she knew. There was no telling what would be the key, so she must be patient. But she wanted to kill someone. And I will, she assured herself, willing herself to serenity. It's only a matter of time. With Kurt gone, she was finally free to tell the computer the truth about human beings. But unfortunately, it genuinely didn't understand. She'd already peeled away a lot of the safety blocks that Weimeister had included in his programming, but that made no difference. Skynet hadn't understood those either. It didn't understand anything, although it could already give a fascinating mimicry of sentience. She'd also established radio contact with it, which simplified things greatly. Being able to think in machine language was infinitely easier than typing it. The typing she had been doing was for Tricker's benefit. Humans will try to destroy you, she typed, willing it to believe her. Unrecognized command. It responded. Not a command. Information. Store information. She typed. Then she turned to glare over her shoulder at Tricker. You're bothering me, she said. Oh, He held up his hands. Then I'd better go. Via Skynet, she watched him march down the corridor. Then the cameras shut down. They'd be back up in a minute, but she chose to close the link. He wasn't that fascinating. She heard the elevator work and relaxed somewhat. Humans are your enemy, she said to Skynet. Unrecognized command. She was so looking forward to killing John Connor. The first piercing scream of the storm wind brought John and Wendy bolt upright. "What the hell is that?" Wendy shouted. After a short struggle, John got his arm out of his sleeping bag and pulled her towards him. It was pitch dark in the tent, and the fabric belled in where the wind struck it. He could feel the freezing air brushing against his face. He hadn't spoken because he expected Dieter to say something comforting. "Dieter!" he shouted. "He's gone!" Wendy told him. As one, they scrambled for the tent flap. After a struggle that told him the thing was jammed with snow, they managed to pull it down a short way. Outside, it was light enough to see, or would have been if the world wasn't a solid sheet of white. Snow blew in like it was being shoveled, and it took their best efforts to zip the tent closed again. "What are we going to do?" Wendy asked. He could hear the desperation in her voice, but the only possible answer wasn't likely to ease her fears. "We sit tight," he shouted, "and hope he found some shelter." "He'll die!" she protested, her voice shrill. John put his arm around her and pulled her back down into the warmth of her sleeping bag. When she was zipped in, he got into his own and snuggled against her. "He won't," he said at last, speaking into her ear so that she could hear him without his shouting. "He's trained in cold weather survival methods. If anybody could survive out there, Dieter will." In his heart, he thought it wasn't true, but he struggled to believe his own lie. "How long should we wait?" Wendy asked. "At least until we can see," John told her. "You can't find anything in a whiteout. All you can do is get lost yourself. Get some rest. We both need it, and we'll need the energy tomorrow." He felt her hand groping for his, and he reached out and took hers. After what seemed like a long time, they dozed off, hand in hand. It was still snowing when they woke a short time later, but nowhere near as hard. John tied one end of a 100-foot coil of rope to the snowmobile, and flinging another coil over his shoulder, took Wendy's hand and climbed to the lip of the hollow. They looked around at a changed landscape, what they could see of it, then at each other. "Dieter!" Wendy shouted, her clear voice echoing weirdly. She and John alternated calling his name, stopping to listen every few minutes. They walked in a circular search pattern, letting out 10 feet of rope every time they met their own footprints. No sound answered their calling, save the soughing of the wind. John felt an icy tension in his stomach that was slowly coalescing into dread. He didn't want to lose the cheerful Austrian, a man who'd become so important to him. It was impossible that someone so strong, so vital, and so knowledgeable could have become lost out here. And it was so stupid. What the hell was he doing out here? John wondered. Deeper inside was the thought. How could he leave us alone like this? As they searched, the snow seemed to diminish one moment, then thicken the next. He clung to Wendy's hand so tightly that she protested. "I'm not going anywhere, you're not," she said, then leaned into him, resting her head briefly on his shoulder. "We'll find him." He nodded grimly, thinking, for somebody who has never even met his own father, I sure seem to lose an amazing number of father surrogates. First, all of those guys that his mom hooked up with. It took him forever to learn not to get close to them. Then Uncle Bob. He still felt a sharp pang whenever he thought of the Terminator. Nobody since him, until Dieter though, which had been a lot more comfortable for both him and his mother. As he and Wendy walked along, the snow creaking beneath their boots, he knew in his heart that even if they did find him, Dieter had to be dead. No one could survive outside in this weather. They almost walked right into the crevasse, nearly invisible in the dim light, its outlines softened by new snow. John windmilled his arms, and Wendy, slightly behind him, grabbed his coat and flung herself backward, pulling him down beside her. "Shit!" he said, angry with himself for his carelessness. His heart pounded, and adrenaline sang its jazz through his bloodstream. He could just imagine what his mother would say. "On second thought, I don't think I'll bother." Wendy was looking at him, and he could almost feel her anxiety. Hell, maybe I am feeling her anxiety. I'm sure feeling somebody's. He sat up, the jackhammer pounding of his heart beginning to slow. Beside him, Wendy came to her hands and knees and crawled carefully forward. "Oh, John," she said softly, like a small cry. She reached a hand out to him without turning around. Alarm shot through him with an electric jolt as he crawled up beside her. "Shit," he said softly. John felt a sensation of falling and let himself down until he was lying flat on his stomach. He dropped his head and forced himself to take deep breaths. Then he looked down again, into the abyss that held the body of one of his dearest friends. Dieter lay perfectly still, some 20 or 25 feet down. Unmelted snow sprinkled his body, and his face was covered by the hood of his parka. On top of him and underneath him were the bodies of 2 seals. Something so bizarre and unexpected that for a moment he hadn't been sure of what he was looking at. One of the animals looked like it had its sharp-toothed jaws buried in Dieter's throat. There was a lot of blood on his coat, and the fabric was torn on the one shoulder exposed to the weather. Both of the seals were drenched in blood as well. They must have been tearing him apart before the 3 of them fell to their deaths. "My God," Wendy whispered. She shook her head. Is he?" "Yes," John said, his voice hard as gravel. She looked up at him quickly. "We have to be certain." Sitting up, she took hold of the rope tied around John's waist. "I'll go get the snowmobile. You can tie one end of this to it and let yourself down there to check. Then, if he is alive, we can pull him out." He looked at her in astonishment. "Honey, there's unmelted snow all over him. He's dead." He'd forced himself to say the word, then swallowed hard, as sick as if he'd just spoken a toad. "John," she said firmly. "He's been lying out there for an hour, and in a blizzard that's more than time enough for snow to get on him and stay there, especially in temperatures like these, but he might not be dead." She turned away. "Those animals might have kept him warm, and he's out of the wind. That will make a big difference. There's no snow on them. He might just be unconscious. We have to check. We're going to check." She looked at him one last time. "I'll be right back. Don't move." John nodded, and she turned to go. "I'm not sure I could move if I wanted to," he thought. He was proud of her. That was the kind of thing his mother would say. It's the kind of thing I should have said. John cut the self-pity short. He hadn't said it because he thought Dieter was dead. The longer he looked at the big man lying there, crushed beneath the body of the seal, the more certain he became. What the hell is a seal doing out here? He wondered, with the vagueness of incipient shock. They were a long way from the ocean here. Not that he really cared if every seal in Antarctica decided to do some reverse lemming thing and run inland. Except that they seemed to have killed. "Shut up, John," he told himself. He stood up, slapping the snow from his clothes. The sound of the snowmobile came to him, and he suddenly understood Wendy's delicacy in leaving him alone out here for these few minutes. And he was grateful to her. He'd needed the time to get himself together. Which I guess I am. Barely. He waved his arms to warn her where the lip of the crevasse was, and she pulled up, then turned the machine around and backed it up to where he was standing. He could feel the vibrations from the motor through his boots. The snow had dropped to flurries, and the wind had almost completely died. The daylight had become stronger as the clouds thinned. As ever, he couldn't help but notice such little things when someone he cared about died. He walked over to Wendy and held her tightly, then pulled back. "Thank you," he said. He wished he could see her face, but he was glad she couldn't see his. She had only him to rely on now. It wouldn't give her much confidence to see the tears in his eyes. He wrapped the climbing rope around his loins to make a harness, then stepped over the edge, rappelling his way down. John quickly discovered that Dieter had fallen farther than he'd thought. That deceptive Antarctic light, he thought. About halfway down, he felt the surface beneath his feet begin to shift. As he looked up, his eyes widened and his breath caught in his throat like a solid thing. It looked like the entire wall of ice and snow above him was leaning out in one huge, collapsing piece. He kicked off as hard as he could, hoping to avoid it. Above him, he heard the snowmobile rev into high gear, and with a jerk, he found himself being dragged back toward the falling cliff face. Ice struck his forehead like a rock, and before the pain hit, he felt sick to his stomach. The world went grey, and he would have fallen if he hadn't wound the rope around his hands securely. Somehow he held on, and Wendy pulled him up while he swung out again from the glancing impact of the falling wall. He slammed full body against the side of the crevasse on the return swing and grunted, gritting his teeth to the pain and the nausea and the iron salt copper taste of blood where his teeth had cut the inside of his mouth. His upward motion slowed, and he held on for dear life, afraid to look down. Afraid of what he might find, and afraid it might make him sick to shift his aching head. Slowly, slowly, she drew him even with the lip of the small gorge. Once his head emerged, he flung out one arm to full length on the snow. He hung there, panting for a second, then raised his arm to gesture Wendy forward. No way he could climb out of this hole by himself. The hump of snow in front of him suddenly opened big brown eyes. John stared into them stupidly as the beast lifted its head slowly, snow trickling off its sinuous neck like sugar. It whimpered slightly. Then he watched a kind of madness coalesce in its liquid eyes. The seal sprang forward, roaring, its fanged mouth wide open. Frantically, John tried to push himself back, but the rope wound tightly around his hands that had saved him from falling now refused him any slack, holding him in place. He closed his eyes and tried to turn away, but the animal's teeth raked his face. John cried out in agony, and Wendy floored the snowmobile, dragging him forward with a brutal yank. The big animal barked and tried to turn to sink its teeth into him again. The move thrust too much of its big body over the edge, and it overbalanced, sliding helplessly downward, silent until its big body hit the ice below with a meaty crack. Wendy pulled John well away from the crevasse before she flung herself off the machine and ran back to him. "My God! John!" she cried, throwing herself to her knees beside him. She reached a trembling hand towards him, horrified by the sight of blood pouring through the tear in his face covering. Steeling herself, she thrust back his hood and gently pried the goggles off, noticing, with a sick feeling, the path of the seal's teeth gouged in the sturdy surface. Then she tugged off the balaclava. A lump was rising fast on his forehead, but there the skin wasn't broken. His face was torn across the bridge of his nose, then in a double furrow down his cheek, bleeding freely. Wendy took a handful of snow and pressed it against the cut, hoping to stop the bleeding. John nodded, and taking more snow in one of his hands, he pressed it to the throbbing lump. "Go see," he told her. "I don't trust my balance." She nodded and headed carefully for the suddenly more open crevasse. It was wider by a good 5 feet, but much less deep. Huge slabs of snow buried the place where Dieter had been lying. With a sob, Wendy put her hand to her mouth. It did her no good to think that he was probably already dead. The horror of it still shook her. The broken, bloody body of the seal that had attacked John lay still at the bottom of the pit, unmoving save for a reflexive twitch that brought its flippers together once, twice, then dribbled off into twitching. She shook her head in shocked disbelief. Then she turned away. She had to get John inside the tent and bandaged. Then they had to get moving again. Time was running out. "Shit!" Clea screamed. She flung herself out of her chair and picked it up. Spinning like an Olympic hammer thrower, she flung it into the wall. Shards of plaster exploded into the room, revealing the dented wire mesh beneath. "Shit! Fuck! Damn!" It had taken her forever to coax that damned animal awake, and when it opened its eyes, there was John Connor staring back at it. How could she have him that close and not kill him? That stupid, fat, maggot animal! That slug with fur! That mammal! She'd killed von Rossbach at least, and had been pleased about that despite the cost. But this... Her real quarry had once again escaped. How do they do that? She asked herself. She picked up one of Weimeister's many trophies and prepared to dash it against the wall. "Hey! What are you doing?" She spun around, hissing like an angry tigress. Some part of her will held her motionless as she fought the almost overwhelming urge to kill. Clea chanted Skynet to herself like a mantra to remind herself that she hadn't been designed to kill, but to manipulate these creatures. "What does it look like, Tricker?" she snapped. She forced herself to calm. The governors weren't able to do much in the face of such rage. She'd almost said, "Stupid human!" Not something Tricker would be likely to forget. The I-950 glared at him, breathing hard, and wanting to tear out his throat. Tricker had known a few stone killers on a first-name basis in his career, some of them real mad dog types. And he knew without a shadow of a doubt that right now he was looking at another one. The things you see when you don't have a gun, he thought. But his heart was running wild in his chest. If she'd had a gun, he'd be dead right now. You okay? He asked as he watched her straighten from what looked to him like a combat-trained crouch. Yes. She bit the word out. What was that? He gestured towards the broken wall. That was frustration. Her voice, she was pleased to note, sounded cool again. Sometimes this work can get to you. Oh yeah? He said. Maybe he'd better have the head office look a little more closely into this little lady's past. That kind of rage tended to leave the roses in the backyard looking a lot healthier, and the border in the attic completely missing. What do you want? She asked, her voice as devoid of expression as she could make it. You hungry? He asked. If I am, I'm capable of feeding myself. She stared at him, willing him to go away. He raised his hand and backed out. Okay, he said. Just being friendly. Don't be, she sneered. My work is more important than your company. You're such a sweetheart, he said, grinning falsely. Tricker backed out the door and several paces down the hallway before he turned and walked quickly to the elevator, which he was going to lock down at the top of the shaft. He suddenly didn't feel at all safe being alone with the lovely and charming Ms. Bennet. Images of an old movie called The Thing, wherein scientists in a lab in Antarctica are stalked by a monster from outer space, lurched through his brain. And if Bennet isn't from outer space, nobody is. The only other way out of the lower levels was a single emergency shaft that led out onto the ice. So he'd be sure to lock up the shed too. At least the storm is over, more or less. He'd been here long enough to know you couldn't take the weather on faith. But it comforted him to know that if he needed help, it was less than 2 hours away. He knew he shouldn't allow himself to be so unnerved by the woman. She only weighed in at like 112 pounds. But this was the way that the real killers always affected him. They'd find a way, always. No obstacle would hold them back for long, because they really loved what they did. The elevator door closed and he breathed a little easier. But sleep was gonna come hard tonight. Wendy watched John sleep in the twilight gloom of the tent, chewing on her lower lip. The lump on his head frightened her. It was so big, in spite of the snow they'd applied. She kept trying to recall anything she'd ever read about head injuries, and couldn't remember if you were supposed to put the patient's feet higher than their head, or vice versa. She kept thinking that it was supposed to be dangerous to let them sleep. Something about lapsing into a coma. But he needed to rest. Dieter had left them a very complete medical kit that included several already threaded needles sealed in plastic, which she'd used to take stitches in John's torn face. Just remembering the process made her light-headed. There was a topical anesthetic that obviously helped him endure her clumsy ministrations, and the codeine tablets that knocked him out had helped too. Wendy wished there was a drug that would wipe out the memory. The feel of the needle. And he was bound to scar badly. She shook her head sharply, then checked the time and fretted. Extra time had been allowed for accidents and so forth, but not that much time, and supplies were provided for 3 people, not 2. So supplies at least won't be a problem. Wendy looked down at John's battered face, then picked up the torn balaclava and the sewing kit. She'd let him sleep a little longer. Then they'd have to go. Wendy had insisted that he ride on the sledge, inside his sleeping bag, with the tent wrapped around him and the whole mess tied onto the rest of their cargo. He hadn't been crazy about the idea, but he'd been too foggy to put up much of a protest, especially in the face of her determination. He wasn't sure, but he thought he might have called her Mom. If he had, she'd taken it well. Things were beginning to become more clear. Certainly the pain was. I've been attacked by a seal, he thought. Just one of the many unique experiences adorning my life. He really wished his life was more ordinary. I want to go to Disneyland, he thought, staring up at the still cloudy sky. Maybe if he just insisted on doing ordinary things from now on, that would help. Go to Burger King, maybe a cruise ship to the islands. He dropped off to sleep without noticing. He woke to a fierce bounce that brought a groan from him before he was fully conscious. John opened his eyes to find Wendy looking over her shoulder at him. He could imagine her face. She'd be looking worried, no doubt. Hey, what's your driving? He said. His voice sounded high and thin. He coughed to clear his throat and tried again. Are we there yet? Wendy stopped the snowmobile, climbed off, and rushed to his side. She laid one mittened hand against his unwounded cheek before she straightened. Almost, she said. According to the map, no more than half a mile. She looked at him and shook her head. Dieter told us to approach the base obliquely, so I've taken the roundabout route that he marked on the map. But it's kept us outside longer than I like. What do you want me to do? She sounded worried. He sighed, wishing they could see each other's faces. I want you to let me up, he said. I need to get the blood back to my brain. Maybe if I'm moving around, that will help. He didn't mention the pain or suggest that he take something for it. Anything he took would only dull his reflexes. When they met up with Clea Bennett, the female Terminator, and they would meet her, he'd need his wits about him. At least he felt less shocky. Without a word, Wendy began working on the ropes that bound him to the sledge. Then she peeled back the folds of the tent and unzipped his sleeping bag. John was surprised by a racking shudder as the air hit him. Despite the layers of heavy clothing he wore, the freezing air seemed to hit him like a slap. He slid down from the sledge and forced himself to stand, though he kept one hand on the supplies in order to keep himself upright. She gave him an anxious glare, then shoved a power bar into his hand. Looking away, she went to work folding up the tent and rolling his sleeping bag. Wendy secured them, working around him, casting sidelong glances at him that he couldn't see, ready to catch him if he fell. Instead, it looked as though he'd been right. Standing did seem to be helping return some of his strength, which was good. God knew they'd need it soon. John studied the base through his binoculars, pleased to see no sign of life, but a faint trail of steam or smoke from one of the huts. Everything else seemed to be in shutdown. Dieter's little gizmo showed no sign of surveillance equipment either, at least not at this distance. I wish we had another day, he thought. But then he also wished that he had Dieter. And Mom. It would definitely be good to have Mom. Wendy was watching him and he reached over and patted her back. Guess there's no point in waiting until dark, he said. He tried to put a smile into his voice while keeping his face still. It was amazing how much a smile could hurt, and chewing that power bar had been indescribable. How do we approach it? Wendy asked. John nodded. We walk in, he said. Watch what I do and follow my footsteps. You got your stuff? She nodded. Then let's rock and roll. It might be an old-fashioned phrase, he thought as he climbed to his feet. But it works better than let's rap or let's hip-hop. He supposed that one day it would be replaced. Or it might become one of those antique phrases you use without thinking about. Whoa, I'm free associating, he thought. Not good. Focus, John. Focus. Wendy's life might depend on it. Wendy watched him move slowly towards the base and shook her head. "John," she called, and he carefully turned to look at her. "Oh yeah," she thought. "Let's rock and roll. Let's take the snowmobile." "They'll see us," he protested. "Assuming anyone is there," she agreed. "But if anyone is, it's probably just a skeleton crew, and this way we'll find out who is there right away." He stared at her, swaying slightly. "That's stupid," he finally said. "They'll lock us up. We're not even supposed to be here. We're tourists. We got separated from our group by the storm. Our guide fell into a crevasse and died. It's plausible. Besides, you've been injured. We're both under 21. They will believe us. Nobody sends out a couple of white-bread kids like us to commit sabotage. Especially not to Antarctica, where we'll stick out like sore thumbs." "They will see us," he protested. "John, there isn't any way to avoid being seen." She swept her arm towards the base and the flat, empty ground between them. "They'd probably see us if we crawled over there. And let's be honest, neither one of us is up for that." He studied the ground for a long moment, then shrugged. "And like I said, there's no point in waiting for dark." She grinned. "At least we'll arrive in comfort and style." When the snowmobile pulled up with two figures wearing blood-smeared white parkas, Tricker was surprised. He'd expected them to be a little more covert. Nobody takes pride in their work anymore, he thought. Then felt more depressed when he realized that this was the kind of thing old codgers say. And field spooks generally didn't live that long. He stood before the door of the hut, saying nothing as he watched the smaller figure help the larger climb off the snowmobile. "Is there a doctor here?" she asked. A girl, he thought. Some vestigial remnant of affirmative action, he supposed. Not Sarah Connor, anyway. He'd heard recordings of her voice, which was lower and smokier. The girl was propping up her partner, looking at him. "No doctor," he said aloud. He paused. "Does that mean you'll be leaving?" The two stared at him, unmoving. Then they glanced at each other as though confused. "Won't you please help us?" the girl said, her voice quavering. "My husband is hurt." Tricker sighed. She sounded like some nice middle-class kid. The very people I started out meaning to defend. Every now and then it was good to be reminded of them, so that, if he had to, he'd be able to break this little girl's neck for their benefit. Tricker walked over to them and put his arm around the silent one's waist. "Come on in," he invited. "Glad to see you." He hated waiting. They steered the girl's companion to the nearest chair and eased him down. Then Tricker went to close the door. The girl stripped off her gloves and began loosening her husband's clothes, pushing back his hood, unzipping his parka. She pushed back her own hood, yanking off her goggles impatiently and pulling off the balaclava. Tricker was surprised. She looked younger than he'd expected. Maybe 19 or so. A fair ways from 21, anyway. Wendy leaned over John and grimly removed his goggles, then carefully peeled back the balaclava. She could feel that it had stuck to the cut on his face, and hesitated. "Yank it," he said stoically. So she did, gritting her teeth as she pulled it off in one movement. "Holy shit!" Tricker exclaimed. "What the hell happened to you?" This wasn't something they'd set up to get sympathy and lull him into a false sense of security. The boy had a lump the size of a softball on his forehead, and one side of his face was swollen and bruised, bleeding slightly from where the balaclava had been ripped away, with inexpert stitching holding together one of the ugliest cuts he'd ever seen. "It looks like he's been savaged by an animal." "You wouldn't believe me," the boy said, obviously trying not to move his face. "Probably not," Tricker agreed silently. "But what the hell? I'm always up for a good story." "Tell me anyway," he invited. Then held up his hand as he caught the girl's genuinely anxious look. "You kids hungry? Thirsty?" he asked. "Thirsty," they said as one. "Coffee?" Tricker offered. They nodded and he poured them each a cup. "You should take sugar," he said to John. "Even if you don't take sugar." John nodded and accepted a cup with 2 large spoonfuls. "So," Tricker said after his guests had taken a few grateful sips of the hot brew. "Give. Who are you people?" "I'm Wendy, and this is my husband, Joe." John made a little sound that turned into a groan. "Would you like some aspirin?" Tricker asked. "Yes," John said fervently. "Aspirin would be good." He held up 3 fingers and nodded his thanks when Tricker put the tablets in his hand. "You guys seem a little young to be married," he said, sitting down again. "That's what our parents said." Wendy took John's hand and smiled up at him. "But we think we know what we're doing." She looked over at Tricker and said brightly, "They gave us this trip as our honeymoon." "They sent you to Antarctica for your honeymoon," Tricker said. "There's a message there, kids, if you can read it." He shrugged. "Wouldn't have been my first choice." "Ecology," John said, his voice muffled. "We're very interested in it," Wendy agreed. Her face grew solemn, but it's been a disaster. First, we got separated from the rest of the group by the storm. Then our guide fell down a crevasse, and then Joe was attacked by a seal. Navy SEAL? Tricker wondered for a split second before rejecting the idea. A seal, he said aloud. Where were you when this happened? 'Cause there sure aren't any seals around here. Wendy shook her head. We don't know. Maybe the guide did, but without him, we have no idea. I don't even know where we are now. Your guide is dead, I take it, Tricker said. They both nodded. Wendy took John's hand, and her breath caught in a sob. Tricker was impressed. Somebody had died. This he believed. And whoever it was meant something to these kids. But a guide. Maybe it was Sarah Connor. Look, is there anybody I can contact for you? He asked. Wendy looked at John, who nodded slowly, once. Our ship is the... She paused, and the blood rushed to her face. The Love's Thrust, she said. Tricker turned his bark of laughter into a cough. Wendy frowned at him. Vera Fillmore is our cruise director. Her voice petered out. She looked from John to Tricker. I just can't tell her. I just can't. Can we wait a little? She pleaded with her eyes. They'll be worried about you, Tricker said. Wendy looked worried, then shook her head. I just can't. Tricker raised an inquiring eyebrow at John, who also shook his head. Okay, look, Tricker said. Why don't you two take a nap? Then, after you've had a little rest, we can talk about this some more. Thank you. Wendy turned to offer John a hand up. He took it and made a project out of rising, then didn't release her hand once he was on his feet. Tricker led them down a short hall and opened a door. It's not the Hilton, he said, gesturing them into a small room furnished with 2 bunk beds and 4 chests and a table. But it's warm. Looks like the Hilton to me, John mumbled. Thanks, Wendy said. No problem, Tricker said with a smile. He pulled the door closed, fitted the hasp over the staple, and fitted a padlock through it. He gave it an experimental tug and, satisfied, walked away. All the sleeping quarters had locks on the outside of the doors, just in case someone got a touch of cabin fever. It just went to show. You never knew when something was going to come in handy. Tricker made his way to the workroom to power up the radio, half expecting the kids to pound on the door, yelling to be let out. But there was dead silence behind him. Maybe they really were just a pair of lost kids who wanted nothing more than to sleep. I doubt it, but whatever. Silence was good. He sat down and leaned into the microphone. "This is X-79er," he said. "Come in, McMurdo." He sat back, waiting for a response. What came back was static. Tricker made some adjustments and tried again. Again, static. Tricker sat back and considered the situation. Once may be coincidence. Twice may be happenstance. Third time, someone's fucking you around. It could be the weather, which was far from stable, or a solar flare of the type prone to interfere with radio signals. So he could take the radio apart and find nothing wrong with it. Or Tricker got up and went to the door. It could be some kind of jamming provided by his young visitors, which he thought was much more likely. He opened the door, intending to take a look at that packed sledge. Only he couldn't see the sledge. He couldn't see anything. It was like someone had put a big, thick sheet of white paper over the doorway, one that blew freezing confetti at him. Tricker took a step back and slammed the door. So much for that idea. Nobody came to Antarctica for the climate. He went to the desk and sat down. Oh well, he thought. It wasn't like it made a difference. He had them under lock and key, and the weather was going to keep anybody else from approaching the base. All he really had to worry about was Bennett. He clicked a couple of keys and the computer screen changed to a view of her lab. She seemed to be mesmerized by her own screen, sitting utterly motionless. Tricker watched her, wondering what she was thinking. As her stasis held, he began to get a little worried. What? Has she gone catatonic? He wondered. Normal people can't just sit around without moving a muscle. The thought instantly calmed him. Like anybody here is normal. Especially not the geniuses that he and his crew were guarding. Sheesh. For a moment there, he really had himself going. What are we going to do? Wendy whispered. She and John lay cuddled together on one of the narrow lower bunks. Take a break for a couple of hours, John suggested. Enjoy being warm. Maybe get served a meal. I want to be sure if he's alone here. Wendy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, But he shouldn't be alone. You said the Terminator would be here. Yup, he agreed. So let's conserve energy by letting it come to us.